This podcast contains adult language. Welcome to the James Chambers Show. I'm your host for this podcast, James Chambers. A small disclaimer before we get started. While I was writing and thinking about this episode, I came to realize that I was kind of talking more to a specific audience than I had initially intended. Many, if not most of the listeners of the JC Show generally agree with my worldview, and when we disagree, it's more about the how, not so much the why of a problem. So in this episode, I'm trying to reach those people who are either they haven't decided about their thoughts on guns in America, or they've been indoctrinated by the gun lobby, including the NRA and right-wing media, so that they're resistant to hearing reasonable, responsible ideas on gun ownership and gun restrictions. Basically, I want to acknowledge that this audience has differing views on the gun debate, but there are some who haven't been allowed to expand their thoughts on the gun issue due to their home lives or their parents or their spouse or their media choices. Many of you will listen to this episode and say, yeah, you're kind of preaching to the choir here, buddy. But there are some who might just need a little exposure to ideas that are different than their own. And I hope this episode is enlightening and entertaining for everyone, but maybe even a little formative for some others. Either way, thanks for being here, and let's get on with the show. Here we are again, having another national debate about what it means to have guns in our society. And more than that, it's about who can have guns in our society and what guns and where. And even more deeply is the why should we have guns in the first place? Let's be crystal clear about why we're having this conversation. We just watched an angry, damaged teenager walk into a high school in Florida and kill 17 students and teachers. He was apprehended and certainly will be facing multiple homicide charges, among other things. He was well known to be troubled, and his name had been given to the exact authorities who were responsible for making sure that he was prevented from hurting others. So, okay, sure, there was a failure of authority here, and sure, there was more that could have been done to prevent this tragedy, but we can parse all the details we want now in hindsight. But the shooter had purchased 10 rifles and ammunition over the preceding year, all legally acquired. Somehow that had not raised any red flags, even though there had been multiple complaints about him over the course of several years. Let's talk about the loose gun laws in Florida, just as an example. You don't need a license or a permit. You don't have to register your firearm. You can conceal and carry your rifle and shotgun legally. You can buy as many guns as you want at one time, and there is no such thing as a licensed gun dealer in Florida because you don't need a state license to sell firearms. Florida does not regulate assault-style weapons, .50 caliber rifles, or large-capacity magazines at all. The only one thing Florida does do to regulate gun sales and ownership is impose a 3-day waiting period on purchases, and concealed handguns must have a permit. That's it. And to be fair, there are some new proposals to change the purchasing age of guns in Florida and things like that after the school shooting, but nothing has changed as of the date of this recording. I submit to you that we all agree that some level of firearm restrictions are important. No, really, we do. You already want and like gun control. Just think about it for a second. How many Browning M250 cals do you see mounted on rooftops in your neighborhood these days? Do you have an MK47 40mm automatic grenade launcher protecting your bowling alley or your golf resort? And what about tanks? Hell, let's all go to the gun show and get an M1 Abrams or maybe just an M1117 as a daily driver, just to get back and forth to work. Look, yeah, we all agree that there is and should be restrictions on people's ability to own weapons. No, maybe not, I guess. Some people are Second Amendment absolutists that there should be no restrictions on gun ownership at all. Okay, well, what about violent criminals? If you want to argue that everyone should have access to weapons based on a fundamentally wrong reading of the Constitution, you must allow the violent child rapist who lives down the block to own a howitzer. I mean, you can't regulate that, right? Because the Second Amendment. And if you disagree with that scenario, and you should, unless you're a fucking maniac, you are for gun control. I'm being extreme for a reason here. We have agreed as a society that the public has no need for a machine gun. We all agree we don't need tanks or rocket launchers or grenades or armored personnel carriers. You must understand that all of our constitutional rights have limitations. They all do. That includes your right to own guns, and rightly so. If you want to live in a war zone and shoot machine guns, the Army is always looking for new recruits, unless you have heel spurs, apparently.
Bing, bing, bong, bong.
Now that we all agree that some kind of limits on gun ownership is responsible and reasonable and proper, the question becomes, what is a reasonable and proper set of gun restrictions that allow for gun ownership and for public safety? That question is the real issue, not the bullshit Second Amendment rights distraction that the NRA and the gun lobbyists want you to focus on. Ignore the noise from the gun lobby and the extremists on the right. Look, between the beginning of this episode until right now, in just mere minutes, we have come to a consensus about the need for reasonable gun limitations. That's where the conversation needs to start in earnest. The sheer statistics related to gun violence and mass shootings are a uniquely American problem. I mean, we have almost 400 million guns in circulation in the U.S. That's more guns than people, more guns than every man, woman, and child of every age in this country. So clearly the conversation is not about taking guns away. It's just not. There is no practical way that any government or law enforcement group could somehow take away all 400 million guns in America. You must dispense with that idea. Some worthless 4chan blogger or some shill from the NRA may propose that any regulation to impede easy access to firearms is just a step towards tyranny, and the government is just waiting to disarm the populace so that they can roll tanks through the streets and reshape America to Russia or Venezuela or North Korea or whoever the boogeyman on the right is these days. And it's just hogwash. It's not real, nor is it possible. They're trying to scare you into buying more guns. And it works. Gun sales spiked when people thought that Hillary Clinton was going to win the presidency. Sales have slumped off during the Trump administration. Gun sales spiked after the San Bernardino mass shooting because there was talk about increasing gun restrictions. Are you seeing a trend? Don't be fooled into allowing the fear tactics to guide your ideas on gun responsibility. So here's some common talking points you're going to hear immediately after a mass shooting, and hell, you're probably hearing them right now. It's not the gun, it's the shooter. We need to focus on mental health first. Gun laws can't prevent all gun violence. A good guy with a gun will kill the bad guy with a gun, and that's just a sampling. If you really want to dive into the bullshit, take a look at your Facebook feed. So let's go one by one. It's both the gun and the shooter. It's not an either-or issue. The reason these mass shooters tend to like and use a semi-automatic rifle with a large capacity magazine and low recoil is because they can inflict maximum casualties and carnage with ease and efficiency. Of course, part of the problem is the gun. Could this kid in Florida have killed 17 people with 2 6-shooters and a kitchen knife? Probably not. And what about the Pulse nightclub? No. The death count is a function of the weapon the attacker chooses to use. So, of course, it's partially the gun. Next, it's a mental health issue. Well, kinda, sorta, maybe. We do need improved mental health services in this country. If you really believe that, and I would agree with you, then you should be outraged that President Trump is defunding health and mental health services by billions of dollars starting in 2019. If the idea that mass shooters have a mental illness, then we're about to have a whole lot more of them, right? And more directly, the facts about mental illness and gun violence don't really seem to point to a strong causation. Only about 1 in 5 mass killers studied were diagnosed with some form of mental illness. The fact is that people with mental health issues are more likely to be the victims of gun violence, not the shooters. Next, no gun law can prevent all gun deaths. Well, no shit. It doesn't take a fucking genius to figure that one out. God, talk about deep moral impotence. Just logically, just because we can't prevent all crime means we shouldn't have any criminal punishments. Just because some people die in car accidents, even though they have seatbelts and airbags, I guess we shouldn't have seatbelts and airbags. I mean, Jesus, should I continue? I mean, this argument is so lazy and frankly dumb that it's not even worth picking apart anymore. Next. Yes, the good guy with a gun. This myth was cooked up by Wayne LaPierre of the NRA, and the conservative movement just lapped it up like a kitten with cream. It fits snugly into the American psyche somewhere between the old-fashioned, rugged individualism idea of the 19th century and the warm embrace of a Glock 9 stuffed into your pants. It's a myth. Remind yourself of the sheriff's deputy that stood by and did nothing while kids were being murdered at the Florida high school in Parkland. Remind yourself that most people who own guns don't have military or police experience and don't know how to handle high-pressure, violent situations. Do you really want more bullets flying in that chaos? The good guy with a gun is an armchair quarterback pulled off the couch and set out to lead the Patriots during the Super Bowl with his potbelly and bag of Doritos in tow. Except, in this case, it's not a trophy. It's people's lives at stake. Let's assume that we're watching a shootout or a mass shooter situation unfold. Even the most highly skilled and trained police officers have only an 18% accuracy rating under those conditions. Only 18% accuracy. So that means out of 100 rounds of ammunition, only 18 bullets hit the target. What happens to the other 82 bullets if you're, say, in the halls of an elementary school? I mean, do you see the point here? So now let's exchange police officer with high school geometry teacher. Even with some basic training, do you really think that the geometry teacher will have the same accuracy rating as a SWAT team member in a combat situation? I mean, not fucking likely. Bear that in mind when you hear the idea of arming the teachers being casually tossed around. You wouldn't be listening to a show like mine if you weren't interested in thinking for yourself. I know that not everyone who listens agrees with my worldview, and that's actually exactly where I want the audience to be. Thinking, listening, making judgments, making arguments, and changing your views when they're wrong. And that's myself included. There are some people who just flatly refuse to listen to any sensible ideas about gun responsibility. So, to those people, I'm going to say something, and it's probably going to sting some of you, and it should. If you can't wrap your mind around the idea that there are some sensible and reasonable gun regulations and restrictions that should be in place across this country to prevent mass shootings, including school shootings, you are part of the problem. You personally bear some responsibility for the deaths of every person, including children, that are massacred going forward if you choose, in the face of data and facts, to do nothing about it. If you can't see your way past your own sense of fun or entitlement about access to guns, even at the expense of our children being gunned down in their classroom, you have a mental illness and you need to be prevented from owning a gun. Your lack of morals and basic fucking human decency scares me. Seek help. So what are basic things that we can do to prevent more death and loss in this country? Well, here's what I believe will help to rein in the insanity around guns in America. First and foremost, universal background checks for all gun buyers. No gun sales are excluded, and even personal property sales. Gun store licensing, including all off-site events like gun shows. All vendors must be fully licensed by the state, and fully insured. Gun licensing. All guns must be licensed to an owner. Any transfer of a personal sale of a gun must be signed over to the new owner via a title or a license, along with a NICS check for the buyer, and filed with the appropriate city or state authority within 30 days, subject to criminal and civil violations. The NICS background check system must be expanded and fortified and must include legal non-citizens, domestic violence convictions, spousal and/or child abuse convictions, animal abuse convictions, violent crime convictions, and people who have been subject to an involuntary commitment to a psychiatric facility for self-harm or the harm of others. A total ban on civilian high-capacity magazines, clips, and magazines would be limited to a 10-round maximum. A total ban on suppressors for civilian use. A total ban on civilian assault-style semi-automatic rifles and associated ammunition. Impose a 5-day, weekend day excluded waiting period on all guns from licensed gun dealers, including rifles and shotguns. And finally, 1 firearm per person, per sale, per day, a day being 12 or more hours, or upon the next calendar day, whichever is shorter. I offer these things as proposals because the vast majority of Americans already agree with nearly everything on that list. If our representatives would just find a spine, they would enact nearly all, if not all, of these common sense gun responsibility restrictions today. And even if everything on my list was enacted today, every law-abiding citizen would still have access to purchasing and owning a gun. No one's rights would be infringed. It would, however, be harder for people who shouldn't have a gun to get one. And isn't that the whole point? We all already agree that not everyone should have a firearm. We also agree that we need to restrict what kinds of firearms are accessible to the civilian population. So now, let's make it real. You can be as deeply pro-gun or anti-gun as you want to be. Your convictions are your own, and that's fine. However, we must come to the center and make an actual change based on real ideas and not fear and distortions. We all, to the left, to the right, and to the center, we must make the gun responsibility argument to others who need to hear it. America can be responsible in our treatment with firearms. We can make restrictions without unduly restricting other people's rights. We must make the plea to our congresspeople and make them listen. Our teenagers are doing far better at this and far more effectively than we are right now. Even more important than speaking to Congress, speak to each other across the aisle about the gun debate. It's hard and it takes time, and it should. Important things usually do. Use this show if you want. I'll send you a Word document transcript or a PDF if you think it'll help have conversations like this with people that you know. Make the argument. Make people listen. Don't let people off the hook when they say more guns are the answer or no law can fix everything. We know that's false, right? We all want to be safe when going to the mall or to a concert or to a movie theater or to our schools. It's up to us to make that happen. Thank you for listening to the Quit Line. You like gun control too, you're just afraid to admit it episode of The James Chambers Show. I would love to hear from you. Comment in the section below the video or email me at realjcshow2017@gmail.com or follow the show on Twitter @realjcshow. As always, thank you so much for listening. Talk to you soon.